Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are so excited to have you here for this exciting conversation about the connection between nuclear weapons and climate change. I'm going to pass this over to our board member, Gail, to introduce herself and Brian Owen. So take it away, Gail.
Hi, everyone. I'm Gail Tarleton. I'm a WAND board member and also a former state representative here in Washington State. I'm thrilled to be here for the Will Action Summit with all of you and with our panelist, Professor Brian Toon. For the next 25 minutes, Brian and I will talk about the connection between climate crises and nuclear weapons and nuclear war. It's not an obvious connection for most people to make, but we're going to have to create a new approach to national security in the decade ahead and in the years ahead. And we need to deal with climate threats. And if we're going to deal with climate threats, we need to come to grips with how nuclear weapons and nuclear war potentially endanger our climate and our way of life. I spent the first 9 years of my career at the Defense Intelligence Agency in the 1980s, analyzing how the Soviet Union would fight and win a nuclear war against the United States. Newsflash, there is no winner in nuclear war. Thus, I've spent the next 3 decades working to destroy nuclear weapons so that we don't relive the Cold War fears of a nuclear holocaust. I'm delighted to have as our panelist Brian Toon. He is a renowned atmospheric scientist and teacher at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Brian has spent a 35-year career helping colleagues, students, and communities investigate and explain how climate science works. But Brian has taken one giant step further into the policy arena to help analyze how nuclear weapons testing and nuclear war pose a catastrophic threat to our environment and accelerate risks to our climate. So, Brian, let's kick off this panel with a question about your students and the research you're into. When students sign up for your classes and work on your research grants, do your students see and understand the connection between climate threats and nuclear weapons?
No. I have a very diverse group of researchers that I've worked with for years. We've looked at taking the National Center for Atmospheric Research climate model, which is the main climate model in the United States, and moved it to Mars, did work on Mars, sort of. We've looked at the climate 2 billion years ago on the Earth when there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. We've looked at the climate a billion years from now where the sun will be brighter and the planet will be in a runaway greenhouse state. So there's a theme here. And the theme is do extreme problems and try to break the climate model. And if you can break the climate model, then you can go and fix the physics in the climate model that broke. And so the most extreme thing we've looked at is nuclear conflicts. So the climate change following a nuclear war between the United States, NATO, and Russia would probably create the biggest climate change since the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. So right now, Russia and the United States between them have 4,000 strategic nuclear weapons that are deployed. There's 500 cities, 300 in the US and 200 in Russia, with more than 100,000 people in them. That's 8 nuclear weapons for each city with 100,000 people in them. You only need one to destroy an entire city. Nuclear weapons were built to destroy cities. That's their purpose. And the way they do that, of course, is a huge blast wave that knocks buildings down, but it also sets fires. And the fires will consume whatever's in the city. There will be a giant pall of smoke and a huge fire, much bigger than any forest fire we've seen, potentially 10 miles in diameter, something like that, from a big weapon. And the smoke from that will go into the stratosphere. It never rains in the stratosphere, so that smoke would stay in the atmosphere for years, blocking sunlight from reaching the ground. So it absorbs the sunlight in the stratosphere, which destroys the ozone layer. It blocks the light from reaching the ground. It gets cold at the ground. And we find at mid-latitudes in places like Iowa or the Ukraine, which are the breadbaskets of Europe and the United States, it's below freezing every day for years.
So Brian,
That's it.
how do your students who didn't live through the Cold War and didn't know about uh, civil defense training and exercises for planning to survive a nuclear blast, how do they react to these kinds of stories that you are helping use climate to explain what the consequences of nuclear war are? Do they know anything about it?
They don't know much about it, but they think this is interesting for two reasons. One of them is that there are lots of things going on the current Earth, like El Ninos. Everybody's heard of El Ninos. They occur every couple of years. They affect the weather and snowfall and stuff like that. But they're kind of subtle. And so they're hard to understand in the current climate because they're not very big change. But when you go into one of these nuclear war scenarios, El Ninos just take over the whole ocean. And so you can understand them more clearly when you go to an extreme case. So that appeals to them. But the other thing that appeals to them is, for example, 2 years ago, India and Pakistan were bombing each other. And there were concerns about a nuclear conflict there. And between them, they have about 400 nuclear weapons. There were concerns about a nuclear conflict because India changed its constitution to take away the autonomy of Indian Kashmir. And so the thing that was interesting there is that the president of Pakistani Kashmir cited our work and said, oh, these people are predicting that 50 to 125 million people would die if we had a nuclear war, and that the smoke from a war between India and Pakistan could spread over the planet and stop agriculture, starve 1 billion people on the planet. So we can't do that. We can't have a nuclear war. We have to solve this problem, conflict between India and Pakistan, some other way. And so people, I think, thought, wow, what I'm doing difference. And students want to make a difference.
The opportunity for students to literally put their hands around the direct relationship between climate events, changes in our that described, and the continued existence of nuclear weapons in the hands of states that can use them at any moment. Has this changed the way that the students and you have chosen to try to reach beyond the academy and go into communities and talk to communities about what is happening in their own state right now that puts them potentially at risk for an accidental nuclear event? Both you and I live in states that have a long history of being associated in some way with the U.S. nuclear weapons program, going back into the 50s and 60s. Our communities today are suffering the longer-term health consequences and environmental consequences of nuclear waste storage, nuclear waste leaks, trying to deal with the public health consequences of being exposed to radioactive releases from either testing or design and development. Colorado had uranium mining, of course. Do you have ways of bringing all of that into the work that you do to bring policymakers and decision makers a greater level of awareness about what's at stake right where we live?
Problem to get people to understand this. I mean, Colorado had 3 nuclear weapons used out in the mountains several decades ago to try to produce natural gas and oil by fracking through nuclear weapons. And they discovered, of course, that the material was radioactive and so couldn't be used. There's about 50 nuclear weapons sitting just to the north of me up near Fort Collins. Most people in Colorado don't know that. What are they? They're called a sponge. Their goal is to attract Russian nuclear weapons away from the coastal cities. Why have them? If you don't want to have nuclear weapons hit, build down the nuclear weapons, move them off the United States, put them out in the ocean someplace. That's what smarter countries like Britain and France have done. I find actually that if I try to give a talk about nuclear weapons, people won't come to the talk. So I combine my talks about the extinction of the dinosaurs and nuclear weapons. People will come and hear a talk about the dinosaurs' extinction. And I think scientifically, there's a strong parallel between what happened to the dinosaurs and what happened after nuclear war. So what happened with the dinosaurs is that all the forest on the surface of the planet caught on fire because of incoming shooting stars from this event. The sky flashed up to be red hot lava. It looked like a glowing lava sky. I tell people if they want to know what happened to the dinosaurs, go down to the grocery store, buy a dinosaur. Chickens and turkeys are dinosaurs. Take them home, turn your oven on broil, not bake, turn it on broil, put the chicken in there, put the dinosaur in there, and it'll look pretty bad in an hour or something. That's probably what happened to the dinosaurs. And that would happen to us if we had a nuclear war. Wouldn't be all the forest on the earth, but it'd be the cities we live in. And the aftermath of that would be smoke filling the skies and possibly extinctions.
It's fascinating that it took bringing the dinosaurs into the story to get people to pay attention. And it's one of the things as a former legislator and a, a former port commissioner here in the Port of Seattle that I have paid a lot of attention to about what it takes to penetrate the noise, the constant assault of information, and to get people to say, this is relevant to where I live. So you and I, we live in states that have been national leaders in attacking climate events and dealing with climate change and introducing policies for cleaning up our energy systems, our electricity grids. Uh, I've lost voice here. And Owen has lost voice.
We can still see you and hear you.
Okay, good. And so, Brian, what I was curious about, you have lived a full life here dealing with climate science and how the climate is changing and how we are helping people understand how to anticipate the kinds of risks that we face, uh, not only to understand why it's happening, but understand what we can do about it. And so this next question is sort of related to the point that you made earlier. You know, we have 4,000 nuclear weapons still in deployed status around the world in the United States. About more than 1,000 of them are here in my state, in Washington State. We would be the third largest nuclear powered state in the world if we were a sovereign nation here in Washington State. The vast majority of people don't want to talk about that. And we do want to talk about climate and what we can do to protect our climate, our air, our water, our soil. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how nuclear crises and potential nuclear risks um, directly affect food security and clean water and clean air, so that when we're pushing to tackle climate change and protect our air and water and our food supply and soils and fisheries and habitat and our forests, it could all go away in a moment if there were some kind of major nuclear accident. So could you talk to us about what the effects are of a potential nuclear event on our agricultural sector, on our food supply? Those kinds of issues come right home to people, and they know what the potential risks are to them and their families and their communities. And I know you've done some research on this kind of these issues here in our country as well as around the world.
Problem, obviously. I assume you're interested in nuclear reactors here having accidents. And some countries have recently abandoned nuclear reactors, like Germany, for example, decided they're too risky to continue to use. And I suspect that in the long run, nuclear fusion will become a possible thing. At the moment, it appears that doesn't produce dangerous isotopes, although one never knows until it's actually practical. And right now, no one's been able to make energy with nuclear fusion. But that may, in the end, be a solution to the world's energy problems. But right now, we're not anywhere close to that. And so right now in the climate community, I see a debate between two different groups that have thought about this. One group is represented by Jim Hansen, who's famous for his work in early recognition of the climate drifting out of control. And he is in favor of a development of a new type of nuclear fission reactor, which he thinks will produce shorter-lived isotopes. But unfortunately, there are also isotopes that are good for making bombs. He sees no hope of the US doing this. And so he's trying to work with China to get them to develop these types of reactors. On the other end of the spectrum, there are people like Mark Jacobson at Stanford, who has designed a renewable energy portfolio for every state in the country and most of the countries around the world to show them how they could develop ways of generating energy, either from hydroelectric power or solar power or wind power. And, you can look at the last few years and see that a large fraction of the installed energy in the last few years has been renewable energy. So it's growing very rapidly. So I don't know how this will turn out between these things. I personally think that fission reactors in the current form are incredibly dangerous. You can see that from Fukushima in Japan, that if you have some unexpected event and you lose your cooling fluids and the local power, that the reactors can become unstable and melt down and destroy a huge area around them. So they're quite dangerous to keep maintaining. But I think some of this comes down to a concept that people should be familiar with, which is that you don't want to do things in the environment with materials that have long lifetimes. So, for example, the problem with the ozone hole is that industry was producing chemical compounds, chlorofluorocarbons, that are not toxic, they're not carcinogenic, they're chemically inert, they're very useful for lots of applications. They're a great product, but they have like a 100-year lifetime in the atmosphere. So they build up and they build up and they build up, and they finally reach high altitudes. Chlorine is released, and it's predicted in the 1980s that in 2050, we haven't even gotten there yet, 2050, there would be ozone losses at high altitude from this. Instead, what happened was unpredictably, the ozone hole developed. And how did we solve the ozone hole problem? Some people think, scientists gave advice to politicians, politicians listened and did something. That's not what happened. What happened was DuPont, who produced these compounds, realized that their patents were expiring. And because their patents were expiring, they weren't going to be able to make a lot of money out of this. However, if there were regulations put in place, they could patent the new stuff and make a lot of money out of it. So they changed sides, sided with the scientist. Politicians said, okay. And in an actual difficult and situation, I think it was an all-night meeting in the Senate to vote on this, and we were fortunate that they passed the Montreal Protocol, which had several important features, one of which was to say, we don't know everything, And so we are going to allow the science community to ban further substances or take further steps without having to go to Congress if it's important to continue to solve the ozone problem. And this actually allows a basis for regulating some greenhouse gases. What's the problem with CO2? CO2 has a lifetime in the atmosphere greater than 10,000 years. When I drive somewhere this afternoon, going to work, or you drive somewhere, 20% or so of the carbon dioxide that comes out of burning the fossil fuels in your car will still be in the atmosphere 10,000 years from now. The other 80% is going to be dissolved in the oceans. How does it ever get removed? It gets turned into limestones like in the Dover Cliffs or the marble in the Lincoln Monument over 10,000 year periods. 10,000 years, that's as long as human civilization, is invention of agriculture. So that's why this is so dangerous and why we have to pull down the fossil fuel production to such a low level because of the lifetime. And the same thing is true of nuclear waste. The nuclear waste has lifetimes of, depending on the isotope, thousands of years. So it's not just a leak like Fukushima. If we keep building nuclear reactors, they get old, they're going to be sitting around in decrepit positions, and we're going to have all that radioactive rock and concrete sitting there. What are we going to do with it? We're going to have to bury it somewhere or something and bury it for 10,000 years.
And so, Brian, it reminds me of the song in the year 2525 from the 1970s, If Man Is Still Alive. I think about nuclear waste and nuclear storage the same way. You have nuclear reactors today. We still have never developed a safe storage science to secure the waste materials from nuclear reactors today. And it's one of the reasons why everything you just described is my reason for saying there is no perfect solution. There is no panacea to getting to clean energy. We are going to need to continue to evolve the research. And so we're approaching the last 5 or 7 minutes of the panel here, Brian, and we've raised a number of issues that people need to sort of wrap their heads around. We talk about in the policy arena and in legislation, the absolutely critical need to tackle climate risks now. The urgency of now is, it's not about 2030, it's not about 2040, it's not about 2050. It's what we are doing right now so that we can get to 2030 and still have some options, still have some windows for adapting technologies, adapting to events that are happening around us, and to understand the longer term effects on public health, on the environment, of not having reached certain goals and certain mandates in some states for moving off of fossil fuels, and not assuming that some magic is going to happen and that there will be some technology solution that gets us out of the mess that we have made for ourselves. So in this final part of the panel, I always like to remind people that we can have all of the best policy and all of the best ideas for changing the status quo, but we have to put our money where our mouth is. We have to fund everything from basic research to applied research, to the development, to the testing, to the work that has to happen in order to translate an idea into an innovation that can actually be put into practice. And following the money to find priorities is sort of a key thing when you think about the full range of where we've been in this discussion, from nuclear weapons, nuclear war, climate events that nuclear war would unleash, climate events that human life is unleashing on us right now. We need to change the way we think about what we fund and whether what we're funding today is going to get us to where we need to be, say in 2030, which is only 9 years away. And I don't know about you, Brian, but I'm of a certain age where I can remember exactly what was happening to me 9 years ago. Uh, and it's not that far away. So I wanted to ask you, in your career, if you had the magic wand, if you could wake up one day and say it's time to change the federal budgets so that we are addressing current and future threats to US national security. Threats to US national security. What should we fund right now? And if we're going to fund something right now, where do we need to either reduce or eliminate budgets so that we're putting our money where our mouth is to fund the priorities for our future? You're muted, Brian.
So one is, I think we should be transferring money out of the military budget and into the State Department and investing around the world in trying to raise the standard of living in countries around the world. And a particular goal, I think, should be the education of women and allowing women to control their reproductive cycles, because we have to get control of the population. And the world is about as populated as it can stand. Right now, every person on the planet has an area of 2 football fields. That's how much area you have for your house, your school, your business, your trash, deserts, ice sheets, 2 football fields. We need to stop the population rise. CO2 is rising just strictly with population. So that's the first thing I would do, is stop investing in useless wars, invest in people around the world. And the second thing I would do would be to stop the useless buildup of nuclear weapons. Why this happened, but the Obama administration gave DOD and DOE $300 billion to rebuild the nuclear. This is an incredibly bad idea. We do not need to build new nuclear weapons. We have plenty of them already. We need to get rid of the ground weapons. They are extremely destabilizing. There are 400 of them scattered up through the middle of the country here. And you can imagine what happens. Thinks they've detected a launch of Russian weapons. Jill Biden has to go in, wake up Joe. Joe, you have 20 minutes to decide to launch our nuclear weapons because we think we're under attack. What does Biden do? Does he launch our nuclear weapons and start a world war? Or does he decide it's a false alarm and not do that? That shouldn't be a choice that each person has to make. And it certainly shouldn't be a choice that one person can make. We need to get rid of the land-based missiles so that no one has to make that decision.
That is such a great way to wrap up this discussion. It's gone by really fast, Brian. Thank you so much for pointing out the obvious to so many of us in the wand and will community. Uh, War is not the answer. A path to peace is within our reach. And I want to thank you for taking the time. And I'll give you the last word for whatever message, story you'd like to share with us as we finish this panel on the issues of nuclear war and climate.
A pleasure to talk to you about, and I hope listeners have learned something from this. But basically, I think we should end in a hopeful note for solvable problems. And there's no one, no matter what your political belief, who wants to have a nuclear war. No one wants power plants fail. So the things that we're worried about are universal problems. No one wants the world to be overpopulated either. So everybody kind of wants the same thing. When you meet people around the world, I have lots of students from other countries, everybody wants the same kind of thing. They want a healthy family, good opportunities for their children, They want to be at peaceful and not feel in danger. So, those are all things everybody wants. So we should be able to find ways to achieve them.
So much, everyone. Never give in and never give up. You have work to do, and we all have work to do together.
So much, Ryan, and thank you so much, Gail, today. It was a great conversation. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience did as well. That wraps up our day 1 of our Climate Week, and we hope to see everyone back here on Thursday for our second day. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your week.